Hello, I am Mike.
Hello, I am Lily. Welcome to English Podcast Flow.
Today we're diving into a challenge that a lot of English learners face,
Yeah.
and it's this idea of stop thinking, start talking.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly common to kind of feel stuck. You have these words in your head, but then when you try to actually get them out, in a conversation, they don't come out smoothly. And we're going to kind of break down this problem and give you some actionable tips, sprinkle in some useful vocabulary along the way. Just imagine being able to express yourself confidently without, having that inner critic holding you back. That's kind of our goal for you today.
Yeah, that's right. It's like there's this invisible wall that's kind of between your thoughts and actually speaking, what you want to say. The ideas are all there, but then the fear of making mistakes or not sounding perfect, can just be totally paralyzing. And here's the good news though. Fluency is not about perfection. It's about communicating. Think about when you chat with friends, in your own language. Do you stress over every single word you're saying? Probably not. So let's figure out how we can bring that same ease and natural flow, into your English conversations.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole overthinking problem a little bit further. What are some of the root causes that make people hesitate to speak freely, even when they understand the language? You mentioned the fear of making mistakes, but are there other things going on as well?
Absolutely. One major culprit is the pressure to sound perfect, like a native speaker. A lot of learners get caught up in, complex grammar rules. They're trying to use all this fancy vocabulary that they're not really comfortable with. It's like they're trying to build this gourmet meal when a simple sandwich would be good enough. This emphasis on, making things complex leads to hesitation, and that makes the whole conversation feel really forced and unnatural. Remember, the goal is to get your message across clearly and to connect with others, not to deliver this flawless linguistic performance.
That's a really great point. Striving for perfection can actually make communication harder. I've noticed that myself.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I'm trying to be too eloquent, I end up sounding unnatural and robotic. It's like trying to fit square pegs into round holes. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
So how can we kind of shift our mindset to prioritize, clarity and connection over, being grammatically perfect? What are some practical steps we can take to loosen up and let the language flow?
One incredibly helpful strategy is to just lower your expectations. And now I don't mean aiming for mediocrity. I mean accepting that mistakes are going to happen. They're inevitable, and embrace them as part of, learning. It's like when you learn to ride a bike. You're going to fall a couple times before you can balance. The same goes for speaking English. You'll stumble, you'll make grammar errors, and that's totally normal. Each mistake is an opportunity to learn and grow. So instead of beating yourself up, view them as stepping stones, on your path to fluency.
That's a great analogy. Reminds me of how kids learn their first language. They don't worry about conjugations or perfect pronunciation. They just experiment, they imitate, they make mistakes.
Yeah.
And they learn through that whole process. So how can we as adult learners, tap into that same childlike fearlessness and embrace the messy beauty of making mistakes?
One technique that is really effective is to shift our focus from complex grammar to simple, everyday language. Instead of struggling to make these elaborate sentences, concentrate on using words and phrases that you're comfortable with, even if they seem basic. Think of it like building a solid foundation. You wouldn't build a skyscraper without a strong base first. Similarly, by mastering the fundamentals of English, you'll get the confidence to expand your vocabulary and your grammatical structures.
I think that's really key, mastering the basics before trying to jump into the deep end. It's all about building that foundation and feeling comfortable to express yourself, even with simple language. But how do we actually put this into practice? Do you have any specific tips for using simple language well in conversations?
Absolutely. One simple trick is to imagine that you're talking to a friend in your native language. What words and phrases would you use? Chances are you'd keep it pretty casual and straightforward. Try to do the same thing when you're speaking English. For example, instead of saying, I am experiencing a heightened level of anxiety about the impending examination, you could say, I'm a bit nervous about the test. Both sentences get the message across, but the second one is more natural and easier to say.
That's a great example. It shows how using simpler language doesn't mean dumbing down what you're trying to say. It just means making it more accessible and relatable. What are some other practical ways that we can incorporate this keep it simple approach into our daily English practice?
Well, one fantastic way is to start describing your daily routine in English. Talking about what you're doing, what you see, how you feel, anything that comes to mind. You don't have to write it down or overthink it. Just let the words flow naturally. Another helpful exercise is to think aloud in English while you're doing everyday things like cooking or cleaning. It might feel a little silly at first, but it's a great way to get comfortable with using the language in a low pressure environment.
I love that idea. It's about making English a part of your daily life, not just something you study from a textbook. What are your thoughts on using things like movies or music to practice simple language?
Those are excellent resources. When you're watching a movie or listening to music in English, try to focus on the dialogue and the lyrics. Pay attention to how native speakers use everyday language. And try to use those phrases yourself in conversations. Don't worry if you don't understand every single word. Just try to get the overall meaning and pick up common expressions. Remember, it's all about exposure and gradually building up your vocabulary and comprehension skills.
It's really interesting how all these seemingly small actions, describing your day, thinking aloud, watching movies, can have a big impact on building fluency and confidence. But it's not just about the words themselves, right? How important is it to pay attention to things like pronunciation and accent when we're trying to speak more freely?
Pronunciation is definitely important, but it shouldn't stop you from speaking.
Hmm.
Remember, the goal is to communicate effectively, not to sound exactly like a native speaker. Every language learner has an accent, and that's perfectly fine. It's part of what makes you sound unique and interesting. Focus on speaking clearly and understandably. And don't be afraid to ask native speakers or language partners for feedback. They can help you pinpoint areas where you can improve your pronunciation without losing the essence of your own voice.
That's such a reassuring message. It's so easy to think that we need to sound perfect to be understood. But you're right. Clear communication and confidence are so much more important than mimicking a native accent. So how can we build that confidence and overcome the fear of being judged for our pronunciation or our occasional mistakes?
One crucial step is to surround yourself with a supportive and encouraging environment. Find language partners, tutors, or friends who will celebrate your progress, give you constructive feedback, and help you feel comfortable speaking freely, even with mistakes. It's also important to remember that everyone makes mistakes, even native speakers. So don't be too hard on yourself when you stumble over a word or mispronounce something. Just laugh it off, correct yourself if you need to, and keep going.
That's such an important reminder. It's easy to forget that everyone, even native speakers, makes mistakes. Creating a supportive and judgment-free environment is key to building confidence and enjoying the process of learning. But sometimes, even with a supportive environment, we can still get in our own way. You mentioned earlier that trying to use overly complex grammar can be a stumbling block. How can we overcome that tendency to overthink our sentence structures?
Yeah, it's almost like our brains get stuck in this loop of translating everything back and forth, between our native language and English. It's like trying to drive a car with one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake. You're not going to get very far. Instead, we need to train our brains to think directly in English.
That is a fantastic analogy.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to drive with one foot on each pedal. You're right that constant translating can really get in the way of being fluent. It's like our brain is doing too much work and it makes it so much harder to speak naturally.
Yeah.
So how do we actually break that habit and start thinking in English? It sounds like kind of a hard thing to do, especially for people who are so used to translating everything.
It definitely takes conscious effort, and practice, but it's totally possible. One strategy that can really help is to start associating English words with images, feelings, or experiences instead of their translation in your native language. So, for example, instead of translating the word happy in your head, try picturing, a smiling face, a sunny day, or a time when you felt happy. That direct connection between the word and its meaning can help you, skip that translation step.
Yeah.
And start thinking more naturally in English.
That's a really interesting approach. It reminds me of when I was a kid learning the names of animals. I didn't learn by translating. I learned by associating the words with the actual animal, how it looked, how it sounded, what it did. It created a much stronger connection in my mind. So do you have any other tips for creating those kinds of direct associations and strengthening that English part of our brain?
Absolutely. Another great technique is to just immerse yourself in the English language as much as possible. Surround yourself with English books, movies, music podcasts, anything that you're interested in. It's like you're creating this English-speaking bubble around yourself. The more you're exposed to the language, the more your brain will just naturally absorb its rhythms, its patterns, and vocabulary. It's like learning how to swim. The more time you spend in the water, the more comfortable and confident you become.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's about creating that constant exposure and letting the language kind of seep into your mind. It reminds me of how I picked up some Spanish just by living in Spain for a few months. I wasn't even studying formally, but just being around the language all the time helped me to start understanding and even speaking a little bit. So for someone who can't travel to an English-speaking country, what are some practical ways that they can create that immersive environment at home?
There are so many resources available now. It's amazing. Streaming services have tons of English language movies and TV shows with subtitles. You can find podcasts on almost any topic you can think of. And don't forget about books. Start with something that interests you, even if it's a children's book or a graphic novel. The important thing is to find something enjoyable that keeps you engaged and coming back for more. And don't be afraid to try different formats and genres until you find what works for you.
You've given us so much to think about already, and I really like how you've emphasized that it's not just about studying grammar rules. It's about connecting with the language in a way that feels natural and enjoyable. But even when we start feeling more comfortable speaking, there's often this fear of judgment, this worry about our accent, about making mistakes, about not sounding native enough. How can we overcome that and speak with more confidence, even if we don't sound perfect?
That's such a common fear, and it's totally understandable. But here's the thing. Your accent is part of what makes you unique and interesting. It shows your personal journey and your cultural background. Embrace it. And remember, everyone makes mistakes. No matter what their native language is, native English speakers make mistakes all the time. They mispronounce words, they use incorrect grammar, sometimes they even invent new words. It's all part of the beauty and evolution of language.
I love that perspective. Instead of being ashamed of our accents and our mistakes, we can see them as part of what makes us unique and authentic communicators. It's like we're adding our own personal spice to the language. But I know even with that mindset shift, it can still be hard to get over that fear of judgment, especially in situations where we're talking to native English speakers. Do you have any advice for building that confidence and pushing past those anxieties?
Yeah, practice is key, but not just any kind of practice. It has to be purposeful practice. Find opportunities to speak English in situations that are safe and supportive. Maybe with a language partner, a tutor, or a group of friends who are also learning English. The goal is to create a space where you can experiment, make mistakes, and get constructive feedback without feeling judged. And remember, the more you practice, the more comfortable and confident you'll become. It's just like anything else in life. The more you do it, the better you get.
Practice makes progress, as they say. But it's not just about how much you practice. It's about the kind of practice you do. Finding those supportive environments where we can feel comfortable taking risks and challenging ourselves is really important. What are some other strategies we can use to build that confidence and resilience, even when we might feel nervous or unsure of ourselves?
One powerful technique is to focus on your strengths and celebrate your successes, even the small ones. Did you have a conversation with a native speaker? Did you order food at a restaurant successfully? Did you understand a movie without subtitles? Take the time to acknowledge those accomplishments. It's so easy to get caught up in what we need to improve on that we forget to celebrate how far we've come.
That's such an important point. Celebrating those small victories. It's like giving ourselves a little reward for all the hard work we're doing. It's easy to get discouraged when we only focus on our mistakes or the things we haven't learned yet. But by acknowledging our progress and how far we've already come, we can stay motivated and feel like we can do this. But what about those moments when we do stumble? When we feel like our English isn't good enough? How can we handle those situations gracefully and keep the conversation going?
Don't be afraid to ask for clarification or for someone to repeat themselves. If you don't understand something, just say, "Could you please repeat that?" or "Could you explain that in a different way?" Most people are happy to help, and they'll appreciate you trying to communicate clearly. And remember, even if you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. Most people are understanding, especially if they know you're learning English. Just acknowledge the mistake. Correct yourself if you need to, and keep talking.
Those are great tips for handling those tricky moments. It's good to know that most people are understanding and want to help, especially when they know we're trying to communicate in a language that's not our first language. But sometimes the challenge isn't just about understanding or being understood. It's about expressing ourselves fully and accurately, conveying all the little nuances of meaning. How can we work toward that level of fluency where we can not only communicate our basic needs, but also share our thoughts and feelings and ideas in a more nuanced and sophisticated way?
That's where the real fun starts. As you get more comfortable with the basics of English, you can start exploring how rich and deep the language is. Pay attention to idiomatic expressions, phrasal verbs, and cultural references. They add color and personality to your speech. Don't be afraid to experiment with different styles and ways of speaking and find your own unique voice in English. And remember, language is always changing. Embrace those changes, be curious, and never stop learning.
I love that. Embrace the evolution, be curious, and never stop learning. That's a great attitude to have, not just for learning languages, but for life in general. It's about seeing this journey as an ongoing exploration filled with discovery and growth. And who knows, maybe along the way we'll even surprise ourselves with what we can do.
We were talking about Not being afraid to be yourself when you speak English, Don't try to erase your accent or speak perfectly. Just try to express yourself and connect with others.
For sure. And we've talked about so many good tips in this episode, like lowering our expectations, embracing simplicity, immersing ourselves in the language, and practicing in supportive environments. It's clear that there's no one secret formula, but a mix of mindset shifts and practical techniques can help us overcome those mental blocks and start speaking English more freely and confidently.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this episode, I think it would be helpful to boil down all these insights into a few key takeaways that our listeners can remember as they continue to learn English.
That's a great idea. It's like packing a toolkit with all the essentials to build fluency and confidence. So what's the first tool we should add?
The first and most important tool is to be willing to make mistakes. Making mistakes is just part of learning. That's how we grow, how we find out what to improve, and how we eventually become fluent. So instead of being afraid of mistakes, let's see them as good chances to learn.
That's a really powerful way to look at it. It's like turning those mistakes into stepping stones instead of roadblocks. And it takes the pressure off so we can try new things and take risks without being afraid of making mistakes.
Right. And speaking of taking risks, the second tool in our toolkit is having the courage to focus on communication instead of perfection. Remember, the whole point of language is to connect with people, to share our thoughts, to build relationships, and to experience the world. So let's make clarity and being ourselves more important than perfect grammar.
That's such a freeing message. It's
Yeah.
like remembering that language is a tool to connect with others, not a test we have to pass. It's about expressing who we are even if we make a few grammar mistakes along the way. What's the next tool we should add?
Tool number 3 is making sure we create a supportive and encouraging environment for ourselves to learn. Surround yourself with people who are happy about your progress, give you helpful feedback, and make you feel comfortable speaking even if you mess up. Whether it's a language partner, a tutor, a study group, or a nice online community, find your people and make learning English a journey you take together.
That's so important. Having that support system can really make a big difference. It's like having a group of cheerleaders who are always there to keep you going, even when you feel like giving up. It gives you a safe space to try new things, make mistakes, and learn from each other without worrying about being judged.
Absolutely. And as we keep building our fluency and confidence, it's important to remember that love as a language takes time. It's not a race. That brings us to tool number 4, the power of patience. Be kind to yourself, celebrate your progress no matter how small, and remember that every step you take is getting you closer to your goals.
Patience is definitely key. It's easy to get caught up in comparing ourselves to others or feeling frustrated when we don't see results right away. But learning a language is a journey, and it's important to enjoy the ride. Savor those moments when things click and celebrate all the little wins along the way. So what's the last tool we need for our fluency toolkit?
The last and maybe the most fun tool is playfulness. Learning a language shouldn't feel like work. It should be an adventure. Find ways to make it fun and exciting for yourself, whether that's watching movies, listening to music, reading books, playing games, or talking with other learners. The more you enjoy learning, the more you'll want to keep going.
I love that. It's about finding that joy in the learning process, that curiosity and excitement makes us want to explore and discover. And when we have that playful attitude, learning a language becomes less about being perfect and more about enjoying the journey, the challenges and the victories along the way.
Exactly. And with that playful spirit in mind, let's wrap up this episode. We've covered so much today, and I hope our listeners feel empowered to stop overthinking and start talking, to embrace their own unique way of speaking, and to keep learning English with confidence and excitement.
Well said. Remember, everyone makes mistakes, everyone has an accent, and everyone learns at their own pace. So be kind to yourself, celebrate how far you've come, and most importantly, have fun. Thank you for joining us on English Podcast Flow. Until next time, keep practicing, keep learning, and keep those conversations going.
Bye, everyone.
If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. It really helps our channel grow and reach more English learners like you. By subscribing, you'll never miss a new episode, and by liking the video, you're letting us know you want more helpful content. Thank you for your support. It means so much to us. Let's keep learning and flowing together.